The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. In 2015, Pope Francis delivered a papal encyclical critical of humanity's damage to the environment and our impact on climate change. Are the pursuit of profit and a prosperous market-based economy inconsistent with the core elements of Christianity? Or, as recent internet memes might suggest, was Jesus actually a socialist? Joining me today on EconVersations is a guest who can shed considerable light on these questions. Dr. Shawn Ritenour earned a PhD in economics from Auburn University and has taught at Grove City College in Pennsylvania for the past 18 years. He's the author of the book Foundations of Economics, A Christian View, and has written and spoken extensively on the connections between Christianity and economic thought, in particular the role of markets. Welcome to Troy, Shawn, and welcome to EconVersations.
Thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Well, before we start talking about economics, we want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about Grove City, because in some ways, in our circles, Grove City is very noted both for one of its distinctive elements. It's refusal to take federal assistance for higher education, and then also it's got a relatively famous economics program and some famous alums as well. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Grove City College in academic circles probably known for the Supreme Court decision that it took to the Supreme Court about remaining independent, and that led to their decision to not take any federal funding and also not to even be participating in the government student loan program in order to maintain their independence, not so that they could do something crazy, but just that they've wanted to be independent of the federal government. And that goes back to some of the leadership of a former president of the Board of Trustees, J. Howard Pugh, who in the 1950s hired Hans Senholz to be the chair of the economics department, and he held that chair, I believe, from 1956 to 1992. Okay. A long time, and really established a very strong free market and Austrian economics tradition there. He was one of the 4 American students that got his PhD under Ludwig von Mises, sort of the dean of the Austrian school, so it's a very strong tradition, and it's one of the things that drew me to Grove City College.
And amongst some of your students that have gone through over the years is a person who's now a professor at George Mason, Pete Becky, and I know he's written extensively about the great influence on him that Dr. Senholz was.
Oh, absolutely. I think he's probably the most well-known of our economics graduates that went on to pursue a graduate degree in economics.
So let's get started here on this topic about the relationship between Christianity and the market economy. So if you can, talk us a little bit about this recent papal encyclical, I guess it was 4 years ago almost now, and it is one of a number of times that the different popes over the years have weighed in on economics or issues related to economics, right?
Yes. I'm not, I'll be honest, I'm not, what should one say, familiar with the minute details of the encyclical, but I do know that it expressed significant skepticism of what we would call a free economy to be able to enable people to be good stewards of creation, specifically in regard to the environment and climate change. And also just this particular, the present Pope seems to be more skeptical of free market in general and capitalism in general compared to the previous couple of popes. So it's an interesting time in that regard. I do think that it would be helpful for him and everyone to be, all Christians to remember that there are certain principles that are in place in creation that actually point to the need for a free society and a free market for resources to be conserved and used wisely and not wasted and not spoiled. And so there's a lot that I think can be learned by that part of what we call general revelation, that part of natural theology, if you will.
And is another thing recently there were internet memes suggesting that was Jesus a socialist? I guess playing on the idea that the Christians have this duty to help the poor and the downtrodden in society, and that if you're going ahead and doing that, then at least running a welfare state or something, perhaps like a welfare state. And these are issues we can come back, and we'll come back to these later on in the program, but just as a way, just raising the question, if you are a Christian, and then when it comes to economics, do you need to be either a socialist or have a position with regard to markets, and something to get us thinking here, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I always hate it when people ask the question, is Jesus a socialist or capitalist or whatever, because, I mean, from scriptures teach that Jesus is the Redeemer, right? He's the Son of God. He's not really the head of a political or a political economic campaign. But nevertheless, the ethics laid down, especially with regard to property, does give us some guidance about what type of economic system is more compatible with the Christian ethic of private property or not, and maybe we could talk about that later.
So, if we're to have a strong and prosperous economy, what would we need to have as the basis of a strong and prosperous economy?
Yeah, I think economic theory tells us that, and our own experience tells us this too, that there are a number of what I call engines or sources of prosperity. One would be just the market division of labor, the fact that if we have a free society, people are able to fit into, find their niche really in society and be able to contribute according to their particular abilities and skills. They're not forced to do something that they're not good at. They can find something that they're relatively better at than anybody else. And what a lot of people miss is that the division of labor doesn't necessarily just benefit the super productive or the super wealthy. One of the great benefits of the division of labor is that if you have a free society, even the least competent person can find a way to, productively contribute to society, and then also benefit from all of the productivity of everybody else. And so the market division of labor benefits the poor just as much as it benefits anybody else.
Well, and I think I'll say it benefits the disabled or differently abled.
Absolutely.
Because they are differently abled, and that means that they likely have some area where they have a comparative advantage.
That's right, and they can contribute. And if you don't have that, then you divide up society between the people that are officially assigned tasks and other people that are officially called dependents. And and over time, I mean that tends to just dehumanize certain parts of our population.
And so, besides the division of labor, what else do we have?
Capital formation, the development of capital goods and assets that can be used productively. As we accumulate those goods, those tools, machinery, plant and equipment, labor becomes more productive, and as labor becomes more productive, we have more goods that we can use to satisfy our ends. Our real incomes increase, and prosperity in general also rises. And then, of course, we've got capital, a fairly extensive capital structure within a market division of labor. By its definitions, can be decentralized, and so it becomes not an easy task to sort of coordinate all this activity so that there's not a lot of waste, so that we are being good stewards of our resources, and that's where entrepreneurship comes in. The entrepreneur, the one who undertakes production, who has to direct resources to their most highly valued use, and that's something I'm sure your viewers know quite a bit about. I know you have a number of people talk about entrepreneurship here.
Right, including entrepreneurs sometimes having to be the ones to deliver bad news, or to say that this isn't a useful way to use resources anymore.
Absolutely, yes.
And entrepreneurs are the ones who come up with new ideas, like the different ways to structure capital or different products that we can produce.
Oh yeah, and different, just different different ways to do retail, in ways that can reduce costs across the board. So now the masses live better now than they've probably lived ever before, simply because of our productive capacity and our ability to direct the scarce goods that we have to their most highly valued use. Okay,
so now as we start to get in a little bit more deeper or get into this, unpack this idea of is there a relationship between Christian beliefs, ethics, and the market, I think there's a first point that you make in your book that I think is very relevant to how we do economics. And this has to do with the topic of human action and whether humans act, because a lot really ends up flowing in ways that aren't obvious if you haven't studied economics. So a lot flows from this idea that people act.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the reason we have and can have a discipline called economics is that there is at least one common existential fact about human beings, and that sets them apart from all other entities, and that's that they engage in purposeful behavior or engage in rational action. And a lot of economists will simply sort of posit that as an axiom or just assumption. We have to start somewhere, so let's start with that. And we'll just assume that.
And just for the slide here, this is Ludwig von Mises.
Yes.
The person who's the mentor of Dr. Senholz.
Yes.
And this is his great magnum opus on writing about economics, was in fact titled Human Action, to just show how this concept is really, truly at the core of economics.
Absolutely. And so, when I teach my classes at Grove City, which is a explicitly Christian college, you have a number of students that are interested in economics, like I was, but yet wanted to know, is this really, how compatible is economics really with, say, a Christian worldview? And so they want to know. I find economics interesting, but I don't want to get walk down the garden path, and I find that, well, this is just sort of interesting game playing based on some arbitrary assumptions. And it turns out, if you look in Scripture, you find that there's plenty of evidence indicating that human action is exactly where you want to start with economic inquiry, because you find out, for instance, that humans are made in God's image. Christians believe that part of that image is our moral reasoning, our moral thought, our moral actions, or immoral act. Not immoral, but what I want to say, our moral sense, I guess. Our ability to act morally the way animals aren't. That's the best way to put it. Our moral nature. But also, we find that just as God thinks and plans and acts with purpose, we find that in Genesis chapter 1, for instance. Human beings, because they're made in God's image, also think and act with a purpose. And so when we begin at that level, we're not saying anything that's contrary to Scripture, anything that's contrary to Christian doctrine or Christian faith. And so there's a common ground there. And so ultimately it turns out that, that economics is something we can sink our teeth into, and we don't have to worry about pursuing an avenue of inquiry that somehow is going to be tainted with worldliness or be contrary to Scripture or something like that.
I guess, because one area where people, students often, when they come to economics for the first time, they think of like they're pursuing profit, and you think of profit as like money, and somehow different from, or perhaps even in contrast to true human values. But money is really ultimately a human value as well, isn't it?
Yeah, well, people value money subjectively like they value other things because it helps them achieve their ends. And if an entrepreneur earns a profit, all that means is he has actually satisfied the desire of somebody else in society better than anybody else. Because in a free society anyway, nobody can force anybody to buy from them. No shopkeeper can say you have to buy from me. If people do, they're doing it voluntarily. And if the entrepreneur is making a profit, that means that this person he's providing a service that the customer values enough to pay a high enough price to more than cover the cost of producing that product. And so in essence, it's paying the entrepreneur to productively provide a service better than anybody else. And so in a free society, there is no distinction between production for profit and production for use, because people earn profits for serving other people. Mm-hmm. Even the most greedy, the most selfish, greedy entrepreneur in a free market could not earn a profit unless he served somebody else.
And then ultimately, we as individuals want money because it better helps us achieve our goals that we want to pursue in our own lives. It's not
Absolutely.
like somehow distinct from what we care about as individuals or our personal values.
Oh, absolutely. We want income so that we can allocate it to the needs and desires we have, and that says nothing about the content of our desires, right? Mm-hmm. We may desire income so that we can help others with it, right? And there's no reason why we should presume that people don't do that. I mean, people, I think, generally do that in many ways.
Another area where I think there's an important contrast between a lot of contemporary thought in economics, but especially outside of economics, it concerns population growth. And
yes.
And there's actually a connection here. The person who's the economist who's responsible for economics, sometimes having his title the dismal science, was also a Reverend Thomas Malthus.
That's right. Yeah, Malthus had a distinct perspective on population, so much so that a particular perspective on population now is called Malthusian. Mm-hmm. And his understanding of population, which was really, I think, rooted in the law of diminishing returns more than anything. Mm-hmm. And that was simply that as things looked to him in 1798, when he wrote the first edition of his essay on population, he thought that the power of people to procreate was simply greater than the power of Earth to increase food. Mm-hmm. And so that, especially amongst the lower working classes, the population was always going to be bumping up against the sort of the food ceiling, if you will. Mm-hmm. And the ultimate result would be what he called misery and vice, that misery is certain, that people are just going to live a tough, hard existence because the people are basically just going to barely be able to eke out. They're just going to have just enough to survive, and that's it. Mm-hmm. And if population went above that, then some people would actually starve, so it was going to be really tough. He thought that vice was probable. It's not absolutely necessary, but a lot of people would be resorting to criminal activity. Mm-hmm. and things like this. It's just going to be hard all the way around. I do think it is important that Malthus was not. He was writing this primarily from a what should one say, a positive scientific perspective. Mm-hmm. He wasn't saying that this is a good thing or necessarily even bad. He said this is the way things are. Right. He did not advocate massive population control programs. Right. Or government sterilization or anything like that. Mm-hmm. That sort of some later people like say Paul Ehrlich kind of supported in the 60s after his book The Population Bomb. Right. He was a little more statist, a little more draconian, and well, frankly, still is. I mean, he's still with us. And recently, he said, I've seen. He wrote an article, The Population Bomb Revisited, where he says, actually, I didn't say anything then that was too over the top. That I would say the same thing now. I'd be even stronger language now. So. So that idea is still with us. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that population has grown significantly, certainly over the 20th century, but at the same time, we have increasing prosperity and decreasing poverty, globally speaking. Mm-hmm. How's it the case? Well, I think Malthus did not see the burgeoning industrial revolution. Right. The increase in capital formation, the increase in technology that was coming, and Ehrlich just seems to be opposed to all of that.
Yes. Yes, and by contrast, however, I mean, a Christian views population growth much more positively.
Absolutely. If you look throughout Scripture, for instance, population growth is always seen as a blessing, both nationally in the Old Testament for the nation of Israel. Population growth was a sign of blessing for their obedience to the Lord's commands, and vice versa. He tells them very explicitly that if you disobey me, part of your discipline is going to be population decline. And then also in different Psalms, for instance, individual children are seen as blessings to individual parents. And so you never see a passage in Scripture where it says, and God cursed them and they multiplied. It's always, and God blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply.
Now, there's also, coming back to the Pope's particular issue they raised about whether markets end up being harmful for the environment or not. Christians are given, in one sense, dominion over the earth, but also expected to be good stewards, right? So
yes. Yeah, absolutely.
This doesn't necessarily mean we're going to end up having pollution.
That's right. No, absolutely. I mean, if you look at what I call the creation mandate, it's really the first broad mandate given to humans at the very beginning to our first parents, Adam and Eve. There is a commandment to be fruitful, multiply, to have dominion over all of creation. And then also in verse 15 of Genesis chapter 2, it says God put the man in the garden to work it and to keep it. Right? And so we tend to, as humans, in a fallen world, tend to want to fall up to one extreme or the other, right? We could just work it and work it and work it without worrying about replenishing it and maintaining it. Or we could go the other way, and we're just going to keep it and treat all of nature as if it's a museum, and we're the curator, and we're going to follow the admonition of MC Hammer, can't touch this. And so both of those ways are extremes. What we're called to do is to reflect God's image in us and to exercise dominion, to draw out the potentialities that are there for us, to develop things that are both useful and beautiful, but to do it in a way that doesn't spoil creation, that doesn't waste our resources. Well, how do we do that? It turns out that having a free market where people are secure in their private property is the best way to do that, because only when people are secure in their property do they, yes, reap the benefit of wise usage, but also bear the cost when things are wasted. Right? And so in a free society, and hence in a free market, there is, the entrepreneur, the owner, has every incentive to use their property productively in a way that doesn't waste or spoil their property. Right. Whereas if you look at the situations that had the worst environmental disasters, those are places where you did not have private property. You had either common property or it was just owned by the state, in which case these entities have very little incentive or even ability to know how to effectively economically care for their property. And then so if there's a bad nuclear spill, or if there's just a bad chemical spill, I'm not responsible for it. It's not my property. Who cares? And so you get these really bad environmental disasters, but it happens far away from a free market. It happens in those settings where there's more state control, more socialist control of property.
And one thing to keep in mind is that with markets and property, I mean, whoever's property is getting polluted has an incentive to protect that as well. So I mean,
absolutely,
it's part of the way of making sure that our resources are owned by somebody, and then that person has an incentive to help make sure that those resources don't get destroyed or discarded or degraded.
Absolutely, and then people also will be held liable if they cause pollution or damage to somebody else's property.
So we're going to come back to the question of whether Christians are called to also take care of the less well-off in society, which raises the question of whether the poor are going to be taken care of in a market economy or a voluntary society, or if we need to have more in the way of actual government assistance in the form of welfare or a basic income guarantee, or which is what people are proposing more recently.
Sure.
Do we need to have a government or government policies to take care of the less well off, or can we rely on markets for this?
Yeah, I think that first thing we want to note is I think it is clear that from a Christian perspective, Christians are called to minister and to care for the poor.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also important to note that the Bible defines poor relatively specifically. It's not just who has fewer goods than the average person in the United States right now. So I think we have to be clear about that. But there are people that we would classify as, say, biblically poor, and we need to be willing to minister to them and care for them. But the question is how to do this, right? It seems like the Christian approach would be to do it in a way that does not violate some other canon of justice. In other words, doesn't just take from somebody to give to somebody else. So that, it seems to me, would imply that no, we don't. Not only do we not need a welfare state, we shouldn't really have one, or at least not like we have one now. I think that I know that a number of churches have both the ability and inclination to help their poor neighbors as they become aware of them. I think that, and I think that we have the resources. It's a challenge now because the state has taken over so much of that people naturally think that it's not their responsibility. That's what the state's for. And if we would move back to a more private, private provision of charity for the less fortunate, I think we would be in sort of it would be a challenge to get it to work, it'd be a challenge to go through the transition process,
right,
because we've gotten so used to the government taking control of these things. It wouldn't be easy just to snap our fingers and go back, but I think ultimately in the long run we'd be better off. And the more free the economy is, the greater the division of labor, the more entrepreneurship is, the more entrepreneurs are able to do their thing, the more productive we would be, the less poverty we would have. And so that even that problem will be smaller than it is now.
And certainly individuals, we would have more ability to help out others who need help.
Absolutely.
If we can take care of ourselves.
Oh, for sure, absolutely.
And then there's also the question of whether you're creating dependency in the manner that you give out assistance. Right?
Absolutely. I mean, you want to get to a point where people can work for themselves. They can work with, as Paul says, work with your own hands, and then you can provide for your family and for other people. Don't get into a habit of living off of other people. And increasingly, in our society today, of course, we're doing just that. We're rewarding people for living off others.
Well, this is very interesting. Any final or concluding thoughts?
I guess the basic thing I would like to leave the viewers with, and the reason of my book, is that there is no ultimate or final conflict between Christian thought and economics. That Christian doctrine about man and about creation tells us that there is something called economic science that we can learn from, and we can learn those lessons, and we find out also that the Christian ethic of property leads us to the institutions that support a free market. And so I find that sort of general revelation and the scriptures, special revelation, both together direct us to a free economy as the best way to fulfill that cultural mandate that God gives us in the first 2 chapters of Genesis.
Well, thanks very much for coming on and talking about this, and thanks for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.